Mrs. Wiggs of the Cabbage Patch. Chapter 5. A Reminiscence. It is easy enough to be pleasant when life flows along like a song, but the man worth while is the one who will smile when everything goes dead wrong. When Miss Hazy was awakened early that morning by a resonant neigh at the head of her bed, she mistook it for the trumpet of doom. Miss Hazy's cottage, as has been said, was built on the bias in the Wiggs' side yard, and the little lean-to immediately behind Miss Hazy's bedroom had been pressed into service as Cuba's temporary abode. After her first agonized fright, the old woman ventured to push the door open a crack and peep out. "Chris," she said in a tense whisper to her sleeping nephew, "Chris, what on earth is there hitched to our shutter?" Chris, usually deaf to all calls, less emphatic than cold water and a broomstick, raised a rumpled head from the bedclothes. "Where at?" he asked. "Right here," said Miss Hazy, still in a terrified whisper and holding fast the door, as if the spectre might attempt an entrance. Chris did not stop to adjust his wooden leg, but hopped over to the door and cautiously put an eye to the opening. "Why, shucks, 'tain't nothing but a hoss," he said in disgust, having nerved himself for nothing less than a rhinoceros such as he had seen in the circus. "How'd he get here?" demanded Miss Hazy. Chris was not prepared to say. All through breakfast, Miss Hazy was in a flutter of excitement. She had once heard a baby being left on a doorstep, but never a horse. When the limit of her curiosity was about reached, she saw Mrs. Wiggs coming across the yard carrying a bucket. She hastened to meet her. "Mornin'," called Mrs. Wiggs brightly, in spite of her night's vigil. "Ain't we got a fine hoss?" Miss Hazy put the ash barrel between herself and the animal and hazarded a timid inspection, while Mrs. Wiggs made explanations and called attention to Cuba's fine points. "Can you come in and take a warm?" asked Miss Hazy as she concluded. "Well, I believe I will," said Mrs. Wiggs. "I ain't been over here for a spell. The children can clean up, bein' it's Saturday." From 7 to 9 in the morning were the favorite calling hours in the Cabbage Patch. Mrs. Wiggs chose the chair which had the least on it and leaned back, smiling affably. She remarked, "We're used to horses. This here's second one we've had." "My," said Miss Hazy, "you must have been well-to-do." "Yes," continued Mrs. Wiggs, "we was, up to the time of the fire. Did I tell you about how Jim brought our other horse to town?" Miss Hazy had heard the story a number of times, but she knew the duties of a hostess. "It was this-a-way," went on Mrs. Wiggs, drawing her chair closer to the fire and preparing for a good long talk. "You see, me and the children was comin' on the steam car train, but there wasn't no way to get the hoss there, 'cep'n for somebody to ride him. 'Course Jim said he'd do it. Poor Jim, always ready to do the hard part." She paused to wipe her eye on her apron, and Miss Hazy wept in sympathy. "Never mind," said Miss Wiggs. "Don't cry. Go on and tell me what you done next." "Well," said Mrs. Wiggs, swallowing the lump in her throat, "Jim said he'd go. He never had been to the city, and he was just a little shaver, but I know I could trust him." "I don't see how you could stand the risk," exclaimed Miss Hazy. "Oh, I reckon whatever you got to do, you can do. I didn't see no other way, so one morning I put an old patch quilt over the hoss, tied a bucket of oats on behind, and fixed some victuals for Jim, and started him off. It was a 40-mile ride to the city, so I calculated to start Jim so'd he'd get to Dr. White's 'bout nightfall." Dr. White was your old doctor, wasn't he? Prompted Miss Hazy. Yes'm, he used to tend Mr. Wiggs before we moved over to Bullitt County. You know Mr. Wiggs was a widow man when I married him, and he had head trouble. Looked like all his infections gathered together in that his head. He used to go into regular transoms. Miss Hazy was awestruck, but more dreadful revelations were to follow. I guess you know I killed him, continued Mrs. Wiggs calmly. The doctor and everybody said so. He was just getting over typhoid, and I give him pork and beans. He was a wonderful man, kept his sense plumb to the end, and I remember his very last words. I was sitting by him, waiting for the doctor to get there, and I kept saying, "Oh, Mr. Wiggs, you don't think you are dying, do you?" And he answered, up just as natural as a fretful like, "Good Lane, Nancy, how do I know? I ain't never died before." And them was his last words he ever spoke to anybody. Was he a church member, Miss Wiggs? Inquired Miss Hazy. Well, no, not exactly, admitted Mrs. Wiggs, reluctantly, but he was what you might say a well-wisher. But, as I was telling you, Dr. White was an old friend, and I pinned a note to Jim's coat telling who he was and where he was going, and I knowed the doctor would have an eye on him when he got as fur as Smithsville. As for the rest of the trip, I wasn't so certain. The only person I know in the city was Pete Jenkins, and if there was one man in the world I didn't have no use for, it was Pete. But when I don't like folks, I try to do something nice for 'em. Seems like that's the only way I can weed out my meanness. So I just says to Jim, "You keep on a-sittin' till you get to the number 6 Injun house, and then you asked for Pete Jenkins. You tell him, says I, you are Herman Wiggs' boy, and as long as he done so much harm to your pa, maybe he'd be glad to do a good turn by you and keep you in the house for overnight till your ma comes for you." Well, Jim started off looking mighty little sitting up on that big hoss, and I waved my apron along as I could, and then I hid behind a tree to keep him from seeing me cry. He rode all that day, and about sundown he came to Dr. White's. Poor little fella, he was so tired and stiff he couldn't hardly walk. But he tied the horse to the post and went round to the back door and knocked real easy. Mrs. White come to the door and says real cross, "No doctor ain't here," and slammed it shut again. I ain't meanin' to blame her. Maybe her bread was in the oven or her baby crying or something, but seems to me I couldn't have treated a dog that-a-way. Poor Jim, he dragged out to the road again and sat there beside the horse, not knowing what to do next. Night was a-comin' on, and he hadn't had no supper, and he was dead beat. By and by he went to sleep, and didn't know nothing till somebody shook his shoulder and says, "Get up from here. What you doing sleeping here on the bare road?" Then he went stumbling along with somebody holding his arm, and he was took into a big bright room, and the doctor was looking at him and asking him questions. And Jim said he never did know what he answered, but it must have been right, for the doctor grabbed hold of his hand and says, "Bless my soul, it's little Jimmy Wiggs, all the way from Curryville." Then they gave him his supper, and Mrs. White says, "Well, he sleep at, doctor? There ain't no spare bed." And then Jim says the doctor frowned like he ever thin and says, "Sleep? Why, he'll sleep in the bed with my boys, and they ought to be proud to have such a plucky fella." Jim never did forget them words. They meant a good deal more to him than his supper. Early the next morning he started out again, and the doctor patting him on the way. He didn't get into the city till long 'bout 4 o'clock, and he says he never was so mixed in all his life. All my children was green 'bout town. It made every one of 'em sick when they first rode on the streetcar, and Europeana was skeered to death of the newsboys 'cause she thought they called babies 'stead of papers. Jim kept right on the main road like he was told to, but things kept a-happening round him so fast he said he couldn't do no more than just keep out of the way. All of a sudden an ice wagon come rattling up behind him. It was running off, and 'fore he knew it a man hit him in the head and veered it round towards him. Jim said his horse turned a clean somersault, and he was thrown up in the air, and "Ma!" called a shrill voice from the Wiggs' porch. "Australia's in the rain barrel!" Mrs. Wiggs looked exasperated. "I never was having a good time in my life that one of my children didn't get into that rain barrel." "Well, go on and finish," said Miss Hazy, to whom the story had lost nothing by reputation. "There ain't much more," said Mrs. Wiggs, picking up her bucket. "Our horse had 2 legs, and his neck broke, but Jim never had a scratch. A policeman took him to No. 6 Engine House, and Pete Jenkins just treated him like he'd been his own son. I was done cured then and there my feeling against Pete." "Ma!" again came the warning cry across the backyard. "All right, I'm coming. Good-bye, Miss Hazy. You have an eye to Cubby till we get our shed ready, and ain't as spirited as he looks." And with a cordial handshake Mrs. Wiggs went cheerfully away to administer chastisements to her erring offspring. Chapter 6. A Theater Party. The play's the thing. Billy's foreign policy proved most satisfactory, and after the annexation of Cuba many additional dimes found their way into the tin box on top of the wardrobe. But it took them all, besides Mrs. Wiggs' earnings, to keep the family from the awful calamity of pulling again a debt. One cold December day Billy came in and found his mother leaning wearily on the table. Her face brightened as he entered, but he caught the tired look in her eyes. "What's the matter?" he asked. "Ain't nothin' the matter, Billy," she said, trying to speak cheerfully. "I'm just wore out, that's all. It'll be with me like it was with Uncle Ned's old ox, I reckon. He kep' on a-goin' and a-goin' till he died a-standin' up, and even then they had to push him over." She walked to the window and stood gazing absently across the commons. "Do you know, Billy," she said suddenly, "I've got the craziest notion in my head. I'd just give anything to see the show at the Opry House this week." If she had expressed a wish for a diamond necklace, Billy could not have been more amazed, and his countenance expressed his state of mind. Mrs. Wiggs hastened to explain. "Course I ain't really thinkin' 'bout goin', but them show bills started me to studyin' 'bout it, and I got to wishin' me and you could go. I don't 'spect it's much when you get inside," said Billy, trying negative consolation. "Yes, 'tis, Billy Wiggs," answered his mother, impressively. "You ain't never been inside a theater any as I have. I was there twice, and it was grand. You ought to see the lights and the fixin's and all the fine ladies and their beaux. First time I went, they was a man in skin tights a-walkin' a rope hissed way up over everybody's head." "What's skin tights?" asked Billy, thrilled in spite of himself. "It's spangles round yer waist, and shoes without no heels, and you say the man couldn't wear many clothes 'cause it would make him too heavy to stay up there in the air. The band plays all the time, and folks sing and spectify, and everybody laughs, and has a good time. It's just grand, I tell you." Billy's brows were puckered, and he sat unusually quiet for a while, looking at his mother. Finally he said, "You might take my show money from last week." Mrs. Wiggs was indignant. "Why, Billy Wiggs," she exclaimed, "do you think I'd take and go to a show when Asia and Australia ain't got a good shoe to their feet?" Billy said no more about the theater, but that afternoon, when he was out with the kindling, he pondered the matter deeply. He was quite cold, and sometimes he had to put the reins between his knees and shove his hands deep into his pockets to get the stiffness out of them. It really seemed as if everybody had just laid in a supply of kindling. The shadowy little plan he had been forming was growing more shadowy all the time. "I expect the tickets cost a lot," he thought ruefully, as he drew himself up into a regular pretzel of a boy. "But then, she never does have any fun, and never gets a thing for herself." And because Billy knew of his mother's many sacrifices, and because he found it very hard to take Jim's place, he lodged in his throat and gave him so much trouble that he forgot for a while how cold he was. About this time he came within sight of the opera house. Tantalizing posters appeared, advertising the greatest extravaganza of the century. He pulled Cuba into a walk, and sat there absorbing the wonders depicted. Among the wonders depicted were crowds of children dressed as butterflies, beautiful ladies marching in a line, a man balancing a barrel on his feet, and yes, there was the man in skin tights walking on the rope. A keen puff of wind brought Billy back to his senses, and as his longing eyes turned from the gorgeous show bills, they encountered the amused look of a gentleman who had just come out of the opera house. He was so tall and fine-looking that Billy thought he must own the show. "Some kindling, sir?" The gentleman shook his head. The posters still danced before Billy's eyes. If his mother could only see the show! The last chance seemed slipping away. Suddenly a bold idea presented itself. He got out of the wagon and came up to the steps. "Couldn't you use a whole load of it if I were to take it out in tickets?" The man looked puzzled. "Take it out in tickets," he repeated. "Yes, sir," said Billy. "Theater tickets. Don't you know the show?" The gentleman laughed. "Well, hardly," he said. "What do you want with more than one ticket?" There was a certain sympathy in his voice, in spite of the fact that he was still laughing, and before Billy knew it, he had told him all about it. "How many tickets could you grim for the load?" he asked in conclusion. The gentleman made a hurried calculation. "You say you have 3 sisters," he said. "Yep," said Billy. "Well, I should say that the load was worth about 5 tickets." "Gee whiz!" cried the boy. "That'd take us all." He followed the gentleman back to the ticket office and eagerly watched the man behind the little window count out 5 tickets and put them in a pink envelope. "One for you, one for your mother, and the 3 of you kids," said his friend, as Billy buttoned the treasure into his inside pocket of his ragged coat. He was so excited that he almost forgot his part of the bargain, but as the gentleman was turning away, he remembered. "Say, mister, where must I take the kindlin' to?" "Oh, that's all right. You can sell it tomorrow," answered the man. Billy's face fell instantly. "If you don't take the kindlin', I'll have to give you back the tickets. Ma don't 'low us to take nothin' that way." "But I don't need the kindling. I haven't any place to put it." "Ain't you got no home?" asked Billy, incredulously. "No," answered the man shortly. The idea of anyone, in any walk of life, not having any use for kindling was a new one to Billy, but he had no time to dwell on it, for this new complication demanded all his attention. "Ain't there nobody you could give it to?" he asked. The gentleman was growing impatient. No, go along. That's all right." But Billy knew it would not be all right when he got home. so he made one more effort. "How'd you like to send it over to Miss Hazy?" he inquired. "Well, Miss Hazy, not having the pleasure of my acquaintance, might object to the delicate attention. Who is she?" "She's Chris's aunt. They ain't had no fire for 2 days." "Oh," said the man heartily, "then take it to Miss Hazy, by all means. Tell her it's from Mr. Bob, who was worse off than she is, for he hasn't even a home." An hour later there was wild excitement under the only tin roof in the cabbage patch, such scrubbing and brushing as was taking place. "It's just like a petrified air castle," said Mrs. Wiggs, as she pressed out Asia's best dress. "Here I been thinking about it and wanting to go, and here I am actually getting ready to go. Come here, child, and let me iron out your plates while the iron's good and hot." This painful operation was performed only on state occasions. Each little Wiggs laid her head on the ironing board, a willing sacrifice on the altar of vanity, while Mrs. Wiggs cheerfully ironed out 5 pleats on each head. Europea was only one who objected to being a burnt offering, but when she saw the frizzled locks of the others, her pride conquered her fear, and holding tight to Billy's hand, she bent her chubby head to the trying ordeal. "Now, Billy, you run over to Mrs. Acorn's and ask her to loan me her black crepe veil. Mrs. Kramer's borrowed it yesterday to wear to her pa's funeral, but I guess she sent it back by this time. And Billy, wait a minute. You be sure to tell him we're going to the show." Mrs. Wiggs vigorously brushed her hair with the clothes-brush as she spoke. Australia had thrown the hairbrush down the cistern the summer before. "Asia, you go get the alpaca from behind the chest and sort of shake it out on the bed." "Who's going to wear it, Ma?" The question came in anxious tones, for the blue alpaca had been sent them in a bundle of old clothes, and though it failed to fit either of the girls, the wearing of it was a much coveted privilege. "Well, now, I don't know," said Mrs. Wiggs, critically surveying the children. "It won't button good on you, and it swags in the back on Australia." "Let me wear it, Ma." "No, let me," came in excited tones. Mrs. Wiggs had seen trouble before over the blue alpaca. She knew that anguish in her decision would bring to one or the other. "It really looks best on Asia," she thought. "But if I let her wear it, Australia'll have a crying spell and get to holding her breath, and that'll take up too much time." So she added aloud, "I'll tell you what I'll do. Asia, you can wear the skirt, and Austria can wear the jacket." But when she had pinned the skirt over one little girl's red calico dress and buttoned the blue jacket over the clean pinafore of the other, she looked at them dubiously. "You do look kind of mixed," she admitted to herself, "but I reckon it don't matter, so long as you're both happy." Just then Billy came in with the veil in one hand and a bunch of faded carnations in the other. "Look, Ma," he exclaimed, holding up his trophy. "I swapped 'em with Pete for a top and a gate. He got 'em out of an ash barrel over on the avenue." "Well, now, ain't that nice?" said Mrs. Wiggs. "I'll just clip the stems and put 'em in a bottle of water. By the time we go they'll be perked up right pretty. I wished you had something to fix up in, Billy," she added. "You look as seedy as raspberry." Billy did look rather shabby. His elbows were out, and 2 of the holes in his pants were patched, and 2 were not. Mrs. Wiggs was rummaging in the table drawer. "I wished I could find something of your pa's that would do. Here's his white gloves he wore the time he was pallbearer at old Mr. Bender's. Seems to me they do wear white gloves to the theater, but I disremember." "No, I ain't gonna wear no gloves," said Billy firmly. Mrs. Wiggs continued her search. "Here's your grandpa's watch fob. but I'm skeert ere you lose it. It's a family remnant, been handed down 2 generations. What about this here red comforter? It would sort of spruce you up and keep you warm besides. You know you've had a cold for a week and your pipes is all stopped up. So it was decided, and Billy wore the comforter. At 7 o'clock they were ready, and the news having spread abroad that the Wiggs were going to the show, many of the neighbors came to see how they looked and how it happened. Some of you shake down the stoves and pull the door for me. I am just that skeert of hurtin' Mrs. Ekron's veil, and I'm afraid to turn my head, said Mrs. Wiggs nervously as she stepped off the porch. The little procession had left the railroad tracks far behind, and Mrs. Wiggs stopped suddenly. For land's sakes alive, do you know what we've gone and done? We have left the tickets at home. At this, Australia began to cry, and gloom settled upon the party. Billy, you run back fast as your legs can carry you, and look in that tin can behind the clock. We'll wait here for you. Mrs. Wiggs wrapped Europeette in her shawl and tried to keep up the spirits of the party as they huddled on the curb to await Billy's return. Look how pretty it looks, all them lights a-streamin' out of the windows on the snow. Looks like a chromo my ma used to have. But the young Wiggs were in no frame of mind to appreciate the picturesqueness of the scene. It was very cold, and even the prospect of the show was dimmed by the present discomfort. By and by, Australia's sobs began again. "What's the matter, honey? Don't cry. Billy'll be back in a little while, and we'll get in where it's good and warm." "I want my supper," wailed Australia. Then it dawned on Mrs. Wiggs for the first time that in the excitement of the preparation, supper had been entirely overlooked. "Well, if that don't beat all," she said. "I had just about as much idea of supper as a goat has of kid gloves." But when Billy came flying back with the tickets, and the party had started once more on the long walk to the opera house, the enticing posters began to appear, and supper and the cold were forgotten.